Hey Renovation Church, Jeremy Cali here on vacation. Hope you're having a good week. I wanted to record a little preamble to this video we're releasing today. You're about to watch something I'm kind of excited about, a conversation I had with two really good friends of mine. A mentor of mine, Eric Knox, and William Payne, who's one of our partners. And what we did is we had a conversation for about an hour about George Floyd, race, a lot of the issues facing our country. And I hope it encourages you. I want you to know that our goal wasn't to talk about politics. Our goal wasn't to try to solve all the problems our community's facing. We really just wanted to talk about how the gospel informs the way different men in this conversation are feeling in response to some of the things our community is going through. Here's my prayer. My prayer is that if you watch it, you'd be encouraged and maybe learn some perspective. My other prayer is that you'd be gracious to us. Just be gracious. I know everyone has very strong feelings, but I hope really this encourages you. You're able to be gracious, and that this is something that informs and helps and blesses you. Thanks.
All right, here we go. So this is our Reno partner cast, but it's a little bit different. There's no way we could even really go another week without talking about what's happening all over the country, all over the world, that was launched from a viral video in Minnesota that, if you haven't watched it, I mean, it's you can't help but have seen at least clips from it, you know, in the news. Absolutely heart-wrenching, devastating video, and it really launched into the forefront for everybody this conversation again, right? It's probably a conversation a lot of people had never stopped having, but some people have in between, you know, events like this. So I had to invite two of my favorite guys that I've known Eric since 1994. So Eric Knox is a mentor, runs a not-for-profit organization. He's been a pastor for years. When I was in college, he was my mentor. I learned about youth ministry from Eric, learned how to preach from Eric, and worked with him in a ministry called Urban Progress that changed my life. Eric, actually, you were the first dude to ever address the issue of race in my life, honestly. And I don't think I reacted well. I think.
How about your grandpa's tomatoes?
Did I really? You remember?
I do.
My Sicilian grandpa picked onions.
They would not let him sell his onions and tomatoes. I was like, yeah, but yours didn't work under the lash.
That's right. Right. But the way when you talk to him, you'd have thought he did. Yeah, and honestly, it sent me on a journey probably in the mid-90s, thinking about this a little bit differently. Working with you in Urban Progress certainly adjusted perspective to the degree that it did. And then me and Will have known each other for the last several years. Our daughters played volleyball. Eric, you guys see his daughter, Alex, who's unbelievable volleyball player and track star. She's at the University of Albany. She's unreal. But Will and I got talking when our kids were playing volleyball together, and he ended up inviting me to be a part of the board with him at FCA. He's a director of FCA at Syracuse University. And, man, I got to be honest, the first couple conversations Will and I had were similar because I was in law enforcement at the time. I was at the DA's office. I remember the first time Will and I had lunch together, we talked about the issues that we're going to talk about tonight. And Will had the blessing of maybe talking to me after being shaped a little bit by you, Eric. So I was maybe a little less.
Thank you, Eric.
I don't know.
Glad I can help you, Will.
But I want to talk to you guys, and I want to ask you some questions and just have a discussion about race, how the gospel informs this, and how to be faithful in the midst of a lot of lack of peace, a lot of turmoil. And maybe it's turmoil that some of us are just feeling from time to time, but it's turmoil that others of us feel all the time. But I want to hear from you guys, your perspective. But first, can you just talk a little bit about yourselves? Will, if you want to go first, just give a little background.
Yeah, William Payne. I've been in Syracuse since 2012. I've been a pastor. I've been in pastoring churches for about 15 years. Started off in Ohio, Michigan, and then I came to New York served here at a church for 8 years. And in 2018, I actually was invited to join FCA as a campus director. So I came on 2018 as the campus director at Syracuse University. And my role there is to take care of the spiritual needs of athletes and coaches. I serve as the chaplain for men's basketball, so I travel with them throughout the season. Spend a lot of time counseling athletes, coaches, Bible study, marriage counseling, just helping meet the spiritual needs of young men and women, coaches in the athletic department at the university. It's a great
awesome.
ministry that I enjoyed doing. So
Huge impact up at SU so far. It's unreal to watch. Eric, how about you, man?
I got saved in 19 at Oregon State and was part of a campus ministry that really shaped my life in terms of the work I did, because as a Black kid growing up in South Central LA in a predominantly African-American community, to be honest, I know we're going to talk a lot about race, but I really didn't understand the race problem growing up in Inglewood until Roots came out, because I was in a very robust Black community where I saw Black business owners and activists and educators and healthcare professionals, and my whole world revolved around that Black community. I thought America was Black until I saw Roots. I saw Roots. I was like, asking my mom, what is, like,
What happened? Yeah.
What happened? Like, this ain't the America I thought I knew. And it started me on this journey and trajectory to me landing and putting down roots in terms of college in Corvallis at Oregon State, and then getting saved, and then in a predominantly white church.
I bet you Oregon was a lot different than your upbringing.
Yeah, way different. And after I finished there, ended up in Portland, working at that time, big white mega churches, having to navigate all that, and then started a work called Urban Progress that you, Jeremy, were a part of. I moved into the hood, toughest neighborhood in that community, 6th and Shaver, because I wanted to be present. I really believed in the incarnational model of Jesus about, living amongst the people you want to love and serve. And I was there because that community is an extension of my community back in South Central. And, did that for 9 years, was simultaneously youth pastoring. And then I ended up planting a church in that community called The Well.
I came back for that too.
Yep.
That's right.
Came back for that. And then I ended up back in LA, planting another church down in LA for about 8 years, and then finding my way back here 7 years ago to start the work that I presently do right now, which is HOLLA, HOLLA, like holla back, holla if you hear me, which is a culturally specific mentoring organization for Black and brown kids on the east side of Portland. And that's pretty much my work.
Something remarkable too that I watched happen just on Facebook over the last couple of years is you taking this girls basketball team at Benson. Can you just talk just briefly about that? Because it's amazing.
Yeah. So I ended up, as a favor to a friend who had just taken the principal job at there's 2 Black schools in Portland, Jeff and Benson. So my buddy got the principal job literally within 2 weeks of me moving back to Portland. And he had heard that I moved back and was like, hey, would you come over and interview for the coaching position at Benson? That's, like I said, that's used to be a very prominent high school for Black kids, but had really fallen on hard times. And I didn't know it because I was in LA. So I was like excited because I was thinking he was asking me to coach the boys team. So I went over there, pumped, and he said, man, I want you to coach our basketball program. I want you to take it over, but I intentionally did not tell you the gender because I knew you wouldn't want to do it. And I said, what are you talking about? He goes, I didn't ask you to come over here and interview for the boys' job, interview for the girls' job. And it's not that I have anything against girls. It's just that I never coached girls before my entire life.
Yeah.
So he was like, look, you were praying, man. Take a week. I already have 15 other applicants. Take a week. I'll give you first right of refusal. And so I took 3 days. And I felt like in those 3 days, I felt like God was like, look, the mission is still the same. You'd like to impact Black boys this is Black girls. So the mission's the same. The only difference is the gender. And so I kind of shifted my mentality and went back to my buddy who's the principal and took the job, and I told him I'd give him a year. Well, I'm 7 years in right now. Wow. 2 years ago, we ended up winning the state championship, and we were the first all-Black girl basketball team in the history of Oregon to win the state championship at the highest classification. And it set the city on fire.
Because, unreal.
It was just unreal, like real talk. PPS, which is Portland Public School, where our school is in that district, they were letting kids out, Black kids in grade and middle school out early, girls, providing buses for them to go to the state tournament, which happened to be in the center of the city, and bought them all tickets. And we'd have hundreds of kids literally at our door waiting for us to run out, because them little kids meant so much to our Black girls that were playing at a level they had never seen girls play at in the state of Oregon. So we ended up winning the state championship, and it was big for our girls. They were, all 5 of them got D1 scholarships, first in their family to go to college. And
so awesome.
It was big for our community. So
just watching the videos of that and the kind of stories you guys put it out there, it was unbelievable. The exponential impact, not just in those girls, but the school and the city, I can't imagine.
And the stuff that happened on our way there, we had down 1 point with 6 seconds left. Girl misses a free throw, we get a rebound, get it all the way down the floor. Girl falling out of bounds, banks it in, we win. I mean,
made for TV, dude. I'm telling you, it's a movie. Who's gonna play you?
The funny thing is that a movie script is being written about.
I don't doubt it.
Oprah Winfrey's network reached out to us about this story.
Yeah.
And a script is being made. I told him.
I feel like you're about the right age for Denzel.
Oh man. I want Terrence Howard.
All right, there you go.
I want Terrence
there you go.
Howard.
Denzel's already done it with Remember the Titans. You can't do it again.
Yeah, we did a new one.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, I wanna jump right into this, and I think the place to start is to ask you just if you could talk about your personal reaction and feelings after you viewed for the first time the video of George Floyd. How'd you just your reaction?
I'll let you go first, Will.
Oh, okay. Obviously, when you see that, your first reaction is anger and frustration, at least mine personally. And I don't know, everybody, George Floyd was very tough and breaks your heart, but the others, the Ahmaud Arbery's, the Breonna Taylors, the incident with the man in the park in New York City, all of those add up, right, to create a story. And part of you wonders, has anything changed? Like, here we go again. And from your, if you want to say from your non-spiritual eyes, there's just a lot of anger in you and frustration, because you think that people don't care. And then people who think they care, they don't understand. And so it's just, in a sense, you almost, for myself, you just kind of want to pull back from people. That's what I want to do. I didn't really be bothered with anybody who didn't look like me, and all those things that go through your head. So just that frustration, disappointment, and anger, probably the biggest thing for me. Concern for my son. Had to meet my family, talk to my kids again, and anybody, most African-American men and women have talked to their kids just about those police interactions with the police and just people in general. So just the frustration with that my son's about to go to school in a year, so just trying to get him prepared for what it could be like.
Yeah. Yeah. How about you, Eric?
I think for me, somebody asked me, goes, what makes this different than all the other police killings that we've seen on videotape of Black men getting murdered by police officers? And I said, 8 minutes and 46 seconds. That's the biggest difference. Like, you have to be cold-blooded to look at that and not have an ounce of empathy, and not realize that fundamentally our country is flawed, especially when it comes to this antagonistic relationship between the Black community and the police force. Like, it's been there forever. But this video was absolutely undeniable. Yeah. And I've never seen America be more woke over this video than they are right now. You know, there's a saying that, I hope I say it right. It goes like this: the blind man is never the blindest man in the room. It's the man that refuses to see their blindness. Yeah. And I've been telling white evangelicals and people that I've been in relationship for years that this exists in our community. They didn't want to hear it. They discredit, deny your experience. And then when they watched that, their eyes were open, right? How blind they were to this systemic issue. You know what I'm saying? Like, this happens every day. I don't think any Black person was shocked by it. No. But just the grisliness of it, and the callousness of Officer Chauvin with his knee on his neck, with his hand in his pocket, I think that like took it to a whole nother level. So,
yeah, I mean, I think everybody that saw that, and that maybe that's what is different this time, empathizes. It's easy to have empathy when you see that video in a human level, right? Yeah. You know what I mean? Yeah. You're watching a man die. You're watching a man die on video, and you're watching him die in a horrific way. Anyone, you know, from my perspective, that was around law enforcement and prosecuted crime for 12 years and knows a ton of cops and worked with police as a part of the heart of my career. And anybody who's done any kind of training, you know, I grew up a wrestler and done some jujitsu and stuff. Anybody that, you know, yeah, that when a man has a knee right below the jawline there on that man's carotid artery and he's putting that kind of weight, you know, you're killing him. You know that's possible. You just know. And it was so sickening to me to watch. But here's what I realized as I talk to you guys and as I listen to people, is I can empathize on a human level, but I think something strikes you guys uniquely in terms of frustration and what Will said, anger and communicating to your son. That's the kind of empathy that is difficult to, unless you, for me, unless I sit and think deeply about it. I don't have a historical personal reaction to it because I haven't experienced those things. I haven't had those concerns walking around in my skin. And that this time has struck me in a different way, to consider, you know what I mean? To consider more and to not just pass off.
All day. And if you think about it, like, you know, like Black folks want to get educated. I've responded to more text messages, been on conversations on Zoom, like here. Every white person that I actually know wants to dig deeper and understand this, and they're always asking for books. But for us, it's not intellectual. Like for us, for us that have to literally live inside this skin, for us, it's emotional and it's personal. You know what I'm saying? Because we have to deal with the brunt of discrimination and stigma and everything that comes along with generational trauma that we've been experiencing beyond our own lifetime, right? That's been passed down from generation to generation. So, you know, I think about my daughter. I'll never forget this story. My oldest daughter, Micah, she's in college now. When I was pastoring, I was in my home office working on a sermon. And she walked into my office and took some printing paper. And she was like 7 years old. And she put the printing paper around her forearm and then started stapling. And I was like, what the hell are you doing?
Yeah.
I'm trying to look like the rest of the kids in my class.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like a 7-year-old girl.
It's hitting her. It's 7.
Hitting her at that age.
Yeah. Will, what about you? I mean, how does as you're dealing with it personally, right? And you're walking through emotions and thinking about how to respond, how does the gospel inform you and your reaction?
Well, if it wasn't for the gospel, then I'd probably be in trouble because my thoughts would take me places the flesh would take me places I shouldn't go, you know?
Yeah.
You know, I want to speak from two veins. That's, you know, my whole life growing up, my father went to school in Indiana. He went to a Bible college in Indiana. We lived in the projects. He comes out of that school. He goes and he serves at his first church. It's a large white church in Indiana. And I remember being there, just things. My parents did a good job, if you want to say, of shielding us from, if you want to say, real life. But it's always there. I remember our school did a play. They were doing the story of Paul. You know the story of Philemon. Philemon. You know the story of Philemon and Onesimus? Yeah. And so in that play, you had to try out for parts. So, except I didn't have to try out. You know who I got to be? I didn't even have to try out, man. They said, hey, you'll be great for this part. I was good old Onesimus. Man, I remember my mother was so hot. Oh, my mother was hot. Oh, she was hot.
They want shooting for accuracy.
So anyway, I say that I've seen, being in church life, I've seen stuff like that over and over again. And you.
How old were you when that happened?
I was 13 when that happened. So you see stuff like that over and over again. When I say I'm talking about the flesh, most evangelical Christians, black men and women, you're taught to forgive, and you say it'll get better, but it keeps happening over and over again. You think, and you get tired.
Yeah.
You're like, why does it always have to be on me? Why do I always have to be the one to say, well, it's okay. Don't worry about it. It's not you. But then you read scripture, right? And the gospel, when I talk about the gospel talks about peace and justice, but it also talks about forgiveness and loving others. And, racism is all throughout the Bible. I mean, you think about the early church, the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians always had struggles.
Yeah.
And Paul reiterated over and over again that they were one and that the blood of Christ covers all of that. So I just believe unless you look at it through spiritual eyes, it's very hard to overcome and to let it go, because it really, things have not changed that much. Like my parents would say that things have not changed that much. The law changed, but the hearts of men have not changed. And if it had changed, these type of things would not be happening still.
I mean, I think this whole thing just, to me, speaks to our sin in such a remarkable way. And the natural reaction is so depraved and so sinful. And we have to look to the gospel to help. I mean, it's how about the reaction, just not just in the church, but or you personally, but nationally, worldwide? Like, speak to that a little bit. This seems different. Yeah,
I think. Well, I'm gonna let Eric go because he's seasoned. He's traveled the globe, and I know that he. I hear his background in that. Go ahead, Eric.
I mean, thanks. I think we can both speak to this. But in terms of globally, man, like
do you think it's going to pass quick like it always does? Or do you think this is going to have some systemic change?
It's already having some systemic change.
Yeah.
I'm saying, so, yeah, I mean, yeah. Will it lose some of its steam? Of course.
Yeah.
Will we get some stuff done? Yeah. But I almost feel like, people ask me, I'm not about this reaction. I'm about action. And it's a way of not listening. It's a cover for listening. You know what I'm saying? A way of discrediting the protests subconsciously. And so, yeah, I mean, I do think that like I said, I've never seen more non-woke white folks who are taking this issue serious. I'm talking to white evangelical pastors who are calling me, asking me if they think I should do a reparations fund. One pastor is pastoring a very conservative white mega church in Phoenix, Arizona, just earmarked $1.5 million and calling it a reparation fund, distributing it to leaders of color in his community in Phoenix. Yeah. Another pastor here in Portland is getting ready to start a reparations fund. You know what I'm saying? So, yeah, I'm seeing some boots to the ground stuff is getting done, even in our own city. You know what I'm saying?
But even if you have systemic change, right? So say some laws change and some you know, people change and leadership. I think if people's, how do we address heart, right? How do we address the human heart in this regard? And it's amazing how our propensity with each other is to be sinful. You know what I mean? And this breeds it a little bit. I think, I even think back to moments, Eric, in our early discussions when I was in college. My reaction to you addressing this issue in my life was, what are you talking about? Because in my mind, I had never experienced it. I haven't seen it. I'm like, I don't have anything against African-American people. I don't have any issue. What are you talking about? How could you say? And so what I wasn't grasping and what I needed to think deeper about and be a little bit more patient with is that there's context and experience I just don't understand.
Yeah.
This seems so trite, but it's something that stands out to me. When I was hanging out with a couple kids from Urban Progress, I was telling you about this the other day on the phone. I was hanging out with Reggie and Leonis, and they were a couple of the high school kids that we were mentoring in Urban Progress. And we went to Lloyd Center Mall in Portland. I was a college kid. I think I drove them there. We're hanging out. We walk into the Gap, and the lady keeps bothering me. Something I had never experienced before. I had no reference for it. So this young white lady walks up to me. She's like, "Can I help you?" I'm like, "No, I'm good, just looking." And then she's kind of stood around looking at us. And then she's like, "Can I help you?" I'm like, "No, I'm good. I'm just looking." And then I'm just walking around. She said it a third time, "Can I help you?" And I'm thinking, what? Leave me alone. Like, what are you talking about? And I look next to me, and I got Reggie and Leona standing next to me. Yeah. And it actually dawned on me in that moment, wow, all right, life's a little different for Reggie and Leonis than it is for me. I had never experienced it. And that seems so small, but I can't even imagine that in a lifetime scale or in a larger scale. The propensity to respond with anger and to get bitter, to get upset. So there's two things, like, how do you deal with that personally in your heart as you walk with other believers of different races? And at the same time, how do you get to that change in the lives and in the hearts of people where that's not their first thought?
So I would, one thing about Black people in general, most of us have been taught, I think it's a fair statement to say, most of us have been taught that you have to function within, if you want to say white society, your whole life. It's just what it is. Like you're not going to be able to achieve or get to where you want to go without interacting with people who look different than you. If you want to say white people, whereas white people don't have to do that. They could go through their whole life and see one Black person in a lifetime. Right. And so I think when you think about that, and you think about from a scriptural, a Bible background perspective, those who don't know Christ, in a sense, your expectation should not be that high, because the scripture says sinners sin. Like we're all selfish, and we know that Christ is the answer. I think the issue lies within the church. How do people who profess to know Christ, who have been in churches, and we talk about the white evangelical church, who have been there for years, who have had the benefit of privilege of being white in America, and who have ignored their brothers and sisters who don't look like them. And I think until that is addressed, and when I say reconcile, a lot of people talk about racial reconciliation. I hear that all the time. You can't reconcile with anybody who doesn't recognize they're wrong in the situation, right? So some people say, like, I didn't do anything, I didn't have anything to do with it. Well, Jesus said you have to look out for the least of these. So in a sense, either you're a part of the problem by your actions, or because you ignored it. Like we're looking at George Floyd, and I think that George Floyd, the biggest impact is the video. And I think for young people, he would equate to, if you want to say, like Emmett Till in my parents' day, which was more brutal. But a lot of young white, I'm talking about our athletes and so on, have never seen anything like that. Right. A live killing. And so I think that's what makes it different. The question is, how does the church respond to it? And in particular, the white evangelical church. And Eric has spoken to the point that some of them, the pastors, are starting to respond. And I think it has to start there.
Yeah.
Of course.
That's what I believe.
Well, man, you spitting hot fire, man. But to piggyback on what you're saying, I agree. It does start with the church, and the church has to be subversive and has to live upside down. You think about Jesus and the kingdom. Jeremy, you talk about the gospel. Think about Jesus for a second. Look at how he arranged relationships. The establishment hated him, right?
Yeah.
The religious and socio-political establishment could not stand him, so much so that they killed him. I mean, here's one of the things that white evangelical leaders constantly call me and ask me. All right, Eric, we have police officers in our church, and we have Black folks that are heavy into the Black Lives Matter movement. How do we honor both? And I say, well, let's just think about the gospel. I don't think Jesus would have ever been like, okay, I got Roman centurions as friends, and I got Mary Magdalene, a prostitute, as a friend.
I got a tax collector and a Jewish zealot, you know.
How do I honor both of them? That was not the subversive nature of Jesus. Jesus always went after the oppressed, the marginalized, people who have been stepped on, right? Yeah. And discounted and discredited as a subversive way of confronting the power structures of his day, right? Religious people couldn't stand him because of who he hung out with. Religious and political powers couldn't stand him because of the people he loved and ministered, tax collectors, Samaritans, minorities, you know what I'm saying? Beggars, blind people, Gentiles, you name it. And that was his revolution and a way of confronting the power structures of his day. So when we talk about, you know, like all lives matter versus Black lives matter, yeah, all lives matter, most certainly, right? We affirm the dignity of every human being. That's inherent in the scriptures. But Jesus always started his kingdom work, or the kingdom always broke in through the lives of the ones who didn't. Yeah. So yes, all lives matter, but it always started on the fringes through those whose life did not matter in the culture. That's why Jesus threw out parables about leaving the 99 and going after the vulnerable one. And so that starts with the church, but the church doesn't want to be in solidarity with the poor. They are too sutured to the rich, to the powerful, right? They're retaining the very power structures that reinforce our own oppression. And that's why the church doesn't have the kind of power and witness it could have to bring a more faithful witness in a society that it longs to express itself in.
And I think they think it's too hard, Eric, right? Yeah. I mean, it is hard. It's hard work. I remember ministering with you. Listen,
hard, wasn't it? Even wasn't the cross too hard?
I know. I know.
Too hard.
Yeah.
Right, kingdom work is uncomfortable.
And we're so polarized racially that it takes significant work that's absolutely worth doing. Listen, if you're a Christian, you have to care about justice.
Yes.
You know, we were talking last night on our podcast about the attributes of God, and the attribute we were discussing is the goodness of God. And the goodness of God as his attribute leads to justice. He's absolutely just. If he wasn't just, he wouldn't be good. So you have to care about justice if you're a Christian. Yes. And when you see George Floyd get killed, your heart should cry out for the injustice. Honestly, Eric, that's why I loved my job the last 12 years.
Yes.
A lot of people ask me, you know, how are you a Christian and a prosecutor? And I was like, listen, my job is to do justice. Like that's my pursuit. I didn't always get it.
Yeah.
I didn't always get it. But you got to love justice if you're a Christian. So, you know, as difficult as it is, it's work worth doing. I mean, when I worked with you in Urban Progress, we'd go down into Northeast, and I watched kids flock your car. You know what I mean? I'm sitting in the passenger seat. They recognized your car coming down the street, and they came running out. It took me probably a year and a half to even get a couple relationships where I was having any kind of benefit. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You had a natural capability, and I think my race was a barrier for sure.
Yes.
So I think some churches, particularly white evangelicals, how do I do it? You know, how do we, you know, maybe it is financial, maybe it is, you know, and even I mean, I think.
Jeremy, can I chime in real quick?
Please, no, chime in.
Think about the kind of work I've had to do for 30 years. Think about the work Will has had to do probably his whole life. He even spoke to it to his dad. How many Black folks, like us, who for decades upon decades are in white churches, biting their tongue, believing in the best of the church tradition, that the bride of Christ can change, will change, and try and be a bridge in it. The question is, you don't think that my 3+ decades in the white church weren't hard? Extremely hard. You don't think Will's dad's work in that space or Will's work was hard? How many white folks are willing to do that in a Black church for 30 years? And not just sit under Black leadership as some kind of symbol, but actually have a Black leader tell you no.
It's a garbage excuse.
Yes.
That it's too hard. It's an absolutely garbage excuse.
Yes.
And it hasn't been the mission of our churches because we're too busy trying to get people in the pews, have enough money, and make everybody happy instead of being on mission.
Yes.
With Christ to have every man, woman, and child have a repeated opportunity to hear the gospel. So, the first church we planted, Missio Church, is sitting in the west side of the city of Syracuse.
Yes.
It's one of the poorest neighborhoods. I think it is the poorest neighborhood in the country. It's definitely in the top 3.
Mm.
And we racked our brains and I know that they're taking steps, but it's long, hard work to minister to the community they're sitting in. Sorry, Will, go ahead, man.
Oh no, I was gonna, man, we often forget Jesus was just radical, man. Jesus was, we like to tell the little stories of the Sermon on the Mount and all the good things, but he was radical. And I think it's not that there haven't been good things that have happened in church life, but there has to be a paradigm shift. We're losing young people. Most churches, most denominations are losing young people because they've seen that the message that we have taught, love one another, Jesus loves everybody, we're going to reach out. We don't practice it. We don't believe it. No. And I think, until the churches, believers get serious about reaching every person for Christ. And what does that look like? What does that look like? It may look like maybe my church, the suburban church, stays in the city. Maybe, there are different things. That people drive to churches all the time. Like we moved to, it's not a bad thing to have a church in the suburbs. It's not, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. But if you're thinking about we want to make an impact that will last, what if that church has said we're going to be in the city and we're going to encourage our members to drive in from the suburbs into that city, put their money into it, go out into the neighborhood, spend time with the people, kind of what Eric said, being present. I mean, that's radical. It's different. And those are things that I think in the future churches will have to think about. That's really the only way it's going to happen, because
how do we miss that strategy, right? I mean, that's something you talked about for years. You and Rod going to the DR. I mean, I'm not going to live behind some missionary wall and a fence. Rod moved right into the neighborhood in the barrios in La Vega, and you did the same thing in Urban Progress. And how have we in this effort missed that strategy? I mean, I think we've been content saying the Black churches are in the city, the white churches are in the suburbs, and they're more effective at it anyway. So why don't we just stay out, right? How do you answer that?
I don't think we believe it. I think that we've fallen for the American dream that at a speaker at a church that this place is our home and we want to make America where we live, our neighborhoods is the end all. And so what we do is we worry about our safety. We say, I have to go out here because it's safe. I have to go out here because there's better schools. Now, if I were to ask the question, what does that have to do with eternity?
So that's
because God's going to ask you, he's going to ask you, did you trust it? He wants us to trust him and depend upon him. And I'm not saying it's easy, because it's not. The Christian life is not easy. But when you trust God and depend upon him, if you imagine if you have 10, 15 solid families moving to the city from the suburbs, because typically only like one person does it, right? You got to have a group of people come in and be committed to it, right? That's how you make impact. And that means you maybe across the street, it doesn't look as nice as your nice little suburban neighborhood. But when you do that and people ask you why you're there, and you say, because God loves you and I love you, and I'm going to be here with you because I want to see people in this neighborhood come to Christ. Well, why would you do that? Because eternity matters. Like, I think that's the mindset we have to have. And it's kind of like being at the university, right? You go to all these games. You know, I go to a lot of games, but the games don't matter, man. I tell people think I love the game. You know, I get excited, but the games don't matter. Eric, you play college ball, right? When it's all said and done, right, the games don't matter, right? The big picture. And that's what we got to get to. What we have to focus on, what really matters. And I think I've gotten away from it. A lot of us, I think a lot of people in the church have gotten away from that.
And at the end of the day, man, I think what we've done is we've exchanged the true gospel for a false one, and a true savior for a false one. And I think the church is more sutured to American consumerism than they are to Christ. And that's the bottom line. You know what I'm saying? And so, you know, America's, you know, like prosperity and comfort. And I think that's, that, you look at our churches, you know, I can tell you firsthand, I bought into that. And I'm sure to some degree I'm still complicit in it. But I remember as a pastor, it was about how many people you get to church, how many services, books, how much you traveling, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like,
and no matter how much you said it wasn't about that, that was the first question you always asked to do to the pastor's conference, right?
Absolutely. You know what I'm saying? My whole identity was rooted in that. And I exchanged, you know, who I was in Christ for who I was in sort of this consumeristic church culture. You know what I mean? And that became an idol in my life. And it exchanged the raw, radical, upside down gospel that we're all called to live into this full gospel that is bereft of any real power to make any substantive change in our society. And that's where we're at right now in our prophetic moment. We're limp wrist, powerless, spineless, and bereft of any real backbone to speak poignantly and prophetically in this moment.
Well, we have Christians on the surface throwing trite, shallow haymakers at each other on social media. In the disconnect in this moment is what bothers me.
Yes.
Because then, you know, I have people like you that I care about that are bothered by this in a way that I didn't understand. Anyone was bothered by the video, but bothered by this in a way that I didn't understand. And when you know, here's what I realized. The complexity of this issue is when you say something, your statement obviously doesn't take into account the whole complexity of the issue, right? Yeah. So you have someone like me react and say, well, why are they burning their own buildings and houses and stores and looting? How does that honor George Floyd? And you have someone respond and say, listen, there's anger. You know, I love that Martin Luther King quote floating around. This is the voice of the unheard. Like this, you know, I've seen a lot of memes where like, you know, we tried to protest peacefully and no one listened. So there's a heart. So is the person that's saying, why is everybody burning buildings down, not taking into account the reality that there's a lot of anger and there's a lot of hopelessness and there's a lot of history here that's caused a reaction that if you felt it, you might understand a little better. And at the same time feeling like, you know, obviously we all wish that people's businesses didn't get burned down, but at the same time we could be a little more understanding about the mass reaction that's happening. I'm sad for the African-American business owner that lost their livelihood, right? But I'm more understanding and realizing too that there is some anger here that caused a reaction. There's some hopelessness. There's some systematic issues that have caused this reaction that we got to think about. We got to scramble back and think about. As a leader, you don't just say, why are they acting like that? You got to say, listen, I got to own it, right? Does that make sense? I think there's a disconnect, particularly on Facebook with the haymakers. It drives me crazy, which is why I haven't said much, to be honest.
Yeah, and to add insult to injury, I can't count on a number of fingers on my hands how many of my Christian brothers have sent me private message articles on Facebook and other social media outlets with articles about George Floyd, like having alcohol and amphetamines and drugs in his system, as if to say he deserved to die. right?
Right.
Like his death was justified. And then at the same time, I have other Christians sending me articles from Christianity Today talking about how he was a Christian that loved Jesus and his impact in Houston in the Third Ward. And I'm like, what is any of that got to do with him dying?
Nothing.
Like whether he had alcohol in his system or he loved Jesus, he still didn't deserve to die.
No.
It's like if you jumped on a airplane and you flew from LA to New York, and you had 250 people on the plane and they crashed in Iowa, and the toxicology report showed that 5 people had marijuana in their system. What does that got to do with the plane crash? Nothing. You know what I'm saying? Like the sanctity and dignity of life is.
Well, I mean, I think that even the law reflects that value, Eric. You
Right.
take your victim as you find him. You know what I mean? If you assault a guy full of fentanyl on the street and you knock him out and he falls down and has a heart attack and die, sorry, you take your victim as you find him. You intentionally assaulted him.
Yeah.
So it's the same is true for this cop. I mean,
Yeah.
and quite honestly, yeah. Anyway, but I think you're speaking more to what's going on in the heart of someone that's sending you that email. What are they trying to say?
Yeah. I mean, they're trying to justify that this guy somehow deserved to die. He got what he deserved. And I think it's ridiculous. You know what I'm saying? Like no ability to empathize with the death of a human being that had no reason to die.
How big is the disconnect, Will, do you think? Between good average Christian white folks and
I think it's very large. I think the average white Christian they have no idea. I mean, like I said earlier, everybody's talking about, George Floyd because we have the video, right?
Yeah.
But this stuff has been going on. It's been going on. There have been people who've been pulled over. Laquan McDowell, different individuals who've been pulled over, shot by police. It just goes on and on and on. And typically, the first thing you do is you try to find out a reason why they did it. And they'll bring up like George Floyd, well, he did something with the check. I think something bigger is going on. I think everything is related to spiritual warfare. I think Satan obviously doesn't, he's involved in this. And I think that in general, that American Christians are going through the great struggle because people are rebelling against the regular norms. The idea like America was a Christian nation. People are starting to question everything that the country is held to as far as, the statues are coming down. People are talking about white privilege. People are talking about reparations. All these different things are all coming up. And I think that the church, the white evangelical church, rebels against that because they have a problem with the idea when you say America wasn't a Christian nation. We know, now if we read scripture, it's not very, I think it's accurate to say if you, by scripture, you couldn't say it was a Christian nation. You could say we were religious because scripture tells us to know God, what it is to know God. And there's no way you could practice slavery, have segregation, all the lynchings, and a lot of those individuals were involved in the church, have all that going on and say you're a Christian nation. So I think we were a religious country, and now people are rebelling against it. And young people, that's the thing, young people. And I think people, so when they make comments like they send to Eric and send different articles, I think that's just part of that. People don't want change to happen in the country. They like the structure the way it's been for years. And it's coming. Change is coming. I don't think, and I wonder if the church is ready for that. The structural changes that will happen with the next generation.
And I think, there's a lot of opportunity for structural change. And here's something that's interesting, because just even talking about history, it's real Christians that have always pushed back against racism, right? I mean, it's the abolitionists were Christians. It's even the earliest pushback against racism is the earliest statement against racism is a monk who says, how could you own someone who's made in the image of God? It was like 300 BC, right? So the value that comes from the scriptures is what drives the hatred of something like that. You know what I mean? So and even if you read the letters from Birmingham jail that Martin Luther King wrote, he didn't tell people to be less Christian to overcome. His letters were encouraging people to be real Christians. If you're a real Christian, this shouldn't exist. If you're a real Christian, and it was real Christians kind of raising up that have made change, throughout history in this regard, right?
That's the beauty of Christianity. Like, so much atrocity has been done in the name of Christianity.
Right.
But on the flip side of it is, it was Christianity that tore down the very things that happened as a result of those atrocities. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. So to your point, yes, like I know Black folks in my community that I walk every day with relationally that have a fundamental problem with Christianity as a whole because they feel like it's the white man's religion used as the tool to subjugate Black people. And they cite all the atrocities done in the name of our Christian faith. And then I have to, push back on that, not in a sense of denying that didn't happen, but also saying in the name of Christianity, it innate in its own faith rose up men that tore down those very structures that were abused through Christianity.
Yeah. And the reality of Christianity is Africans were Christians before we were. I mean, it's not a white religion in that regard, right? I mean, it's
that story or that African proverb that says until a lion gets a historian, tales of hunting will always glorify the hunter.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And so I think a whole new storyline narrative is being reshaped to Will's point, like sort of this white, docile, white supremacist Christianity that reinforces the power structures of our society. I, for the first time, believe that is about to shift as our country shifts.
And honestly, from someone who's spent a lot of time looking at the system, being a part of the system, reading the laws and having to know them backwards and forwards in terms of the criminal justice system, it's not the words. It's not the words of the law that are racist in any regard. It's the hearts of the people dealing with it and enforcing it, right? Not that there's not some words that don't need to be changed. You know what I mean? And I think we've made a lot of progress in changing over the years, but there's more progress to be made, and I think there's a lot of discussion to be had. But I think it goes back to the hearts of the people. It goes back to the gospel because the law can be race neutral in a sense, but if the people carrying it out are sinful in that regard, it's not going to feel that way. Right. and
right. Same with the Bible. Like if the Bible's put in the hands of the wrong person, it can be a tool for oppression.
Yeah.
Put in the right person, it can be a tool to dismantle oppression.
And the reality is the solution is the gospel. The solution is the sin in our hearts being redeemed. And the solution's not law enforcement in the criminal justice system in so many ways. Right? I mean, I think I was talking to Eric about this on the phone. I just researching some of this myself over the years, being a part of the system, there's law enforcement, it's too late when law enforcement's involved, right? I mean, you if you think about New York City in the 80s and the 90s, the homicide rate was through the roof. Thousands of people were dying, and it was bad. And so you enter Giuliani and Ray Kelly, and you enter broken windows and really aggressive law enforcement, and what some people might even think of or talk about as occupation type law enforcement. The crime rate in New York City goes down 60%. 60%. The crime rate in the state, everywhere else in the state went up, but statewide the crime rate went down 60%. New York City was transformed. But you know what? Hundreds, probably thousands of young Black men were in prison, right? And so law enforcement's not the answer. I don't think any of those solutions are tenable for anybody. I'm so over the years, one of the things that bothers me the most is I saw a lot of death. I saw a lot of dead bodies. The stuff that I can't get out of my head that keeps me up at night is watching. I still have pictured in my head mothers running up to a sidewalk behind a police line, in that little muscle in their knee just gives out every time when they see their kid laying on the sidewalk dead, and watching moms lose their knees and weep over their dead kids is one of the things that affected me the most as a prosecutor. There's a lot of things, so here's a movement now to defund police. I don't know that that's the answer. I guess what I'm getting at, and I'm talking all around it, is the gospel change has to be the answer. Is that too simple?
I think and that's funny. It's the simplest things that we avoid. It's the gospel. The gospel is it's clear that it's the gospel that will ultimately change lives. The hard part is who's supposed to spread the gospel. You ask that, if I were to ask you who's supposed to spread it, and it's just believers, right? Believers are supposed to share the gospel. God uses people to interact with other people. But if you're not willing to share it, then it's a lost cause. And the problem is the churches, we're not evangelizing like we need to. It is, and when people come to Christ, their life can't help be changed. And when they come to Christ, it takes away the hate, the anger, and all the other things that come along with that. Anything outside of that is just putting a Band-Aid on the situation. And we've been doing that for years. Band-Aid after Band-Aid.
I got to confess, I got jaded, guys. I can't tell you how many times I met with a witness or a young African-American guy or a young African-American girl or woman or man in the city over the course of dealing with the worst things to happen in people's lives. I can't tell you how many times I said to myself, and I'm not kidding, Eric, hopeless. This kid's shot. Like, no hope. And I probably even thought dozens of times, man, I wish Eric could come here.
Wow.
I wish he could come to Cuse and work with these kids, because I saw the effect you had in Portland. Never once thinking, you know what I mean, could I have more of an impact than just these moments, that I had as a prosecutor in people's lives?
You know what, man? I hear you, man. And faint not, be of good cheer. Because I'm hopeful. And I'm hopeful because, I think when we say the gospel's the answer, I think evangelical Christians go a certain direction with that. Like,
yeah. What's the nuts and bolts? Yeah. How is it the answer? How do you get at it? Yeah.
I think oftentimes, like when we look at the scriptures, like you take the parables of Jesus, and if you take the parables of Jesus and you look at it from the most powerful person in the parable, what they end up doing is reinforcing the existing power structures of our day. But if you see it from the least powerful person in the parable, it challenges you to live subversive. So I'll give you an example, all right? Like take the parable of the persistent widow who goes to the unjust judge because of how she's being treated. How many times in church circles of ours did we hear that as some kind of teaching on the power of persistent prayer? Like wear the judge out and the judge will give you what you want, as if to say, wear God out and he'll give you what you want. That is not what that parable's talking about, right? This woman is wanting justice. The judge is unjust. The judge is not God. The judge is an unjust judge, period. Yes, you need to pray, but that thing is all framed in the context of justice. On the one hand, the church needs to be out there in the streets, confronting systems persistently, wearing these systems out. And yet at the same time, they need to be doing them prayerfully. Change that parable and puts it completely on its head when you look at it from that perspective. It's not just some teaching about if you want a car or a house or a job, you wear God out until he gives it to you. That is not what the parable's about. It's about a powerless widow who on her knees and through her actions wears out unjust systems. Could you imagine if we preached the gospel that way? We would never preach the gospel that way.
Can you imagine if churches and Christians let me say it this way, being a young, I'm 44, being a suburban conservative bent politically guy, and I'm not getting into politics, but I think this is a challenge. So say you're conservative economically and you say, listen, I'm so tired of high taxes. I'm so tired of me paying money to take care of other people. I think we got to take care of people who can't take care of themselves, but it's too much. The government shouldn't do it. The government shouldn't do it. The government shouldn't do it. Great. Valid position. Probably a position I hold economically. But if you're a Christian and you don't believe the government should do it, and there's people starving, there's people hurting, and there's people in need, then you better darn well be a part of a ministry or a church or be giving sacrificially so that you're doing it, because that's what you're called to. If you don't think the government's any good at it, the church has got to be good at it.
Yeah.
You should be the one doing it.
But not only if you believe that the government's not doing a good job because it's corrupt, you got to understand there's a system of corruption that has happened generationally.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That creates the conditions of poverty and oppression that exist in their own city. That's why if you read the major prophets, man, I don't know how many times we watered down the major and minor prophets as if they were just saying you're just not being fair with the poor and therefore God's not honoring you through your worship and giving. Man, them prophets, man, they were prophetic, man. Like, I don't know if the church could stomach them. I think we'd write off Jeremiah, Isaiah, Malachi, and all of them. So, yeah, I mean, to a certain degree, I think, you know, we're never absolved from confronting unjust systems in our society, regardless of regardless of who's in office. I got issues. I always say Republicans and Democrats ain't good for Black people.
Right.
This two-party system ain't good for Black people.
Sure.
Period.
What do you think, Will?
Well, he gonna say that, man. He gonna come with the he gonna slam my party. But anyway, he gonna slam my party.
I'm sorry, Will.
Look,
I think you slam mine too.
When I talk about the gospel, because you're right when you say that people just say the gospel, what does it mean? The gospel is to be lived out also, and how you know, the greatest commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, love your neighbor as yourself. And when you see people as people, and when you see them with the eyes of Christ, and when there are unjust things going on, then you step up. And I think that politicians, it's hard for me because politicians, I just believe if a person doesn't know God, they have one tendency. That's to look out for themselves.
Of course.
Okay, so the churches definitely need to speak up when they see things, but people have been speaking up for years. I really just want people to take the action and start to do things, and whether someone's going to listen to you or not, you can still step up. It's kind of similar to what you're talking about. A lot of conservatives, they don't like giving their money. They're like, why should we give to the government? But the truth is, if the government didn't take their money to help other people, they wouldn't give it themselves.
That's what I'm talking about. Right.
They wouldn't do that. And there's really not enough money in place. If you took all the churches in America, that would help meet the needs of the poor, because the system, the structures, have been going on for so long. So what can the church do? The church can start from where they are right now by really loving people, caring for them, stepping up for the oppressed. How do you do that? It's been a good thing to see some of the churches walk in the protest. That's been great to see them. But there are a lot of pastors who have, white evangelical pastors, just like the African-American pastors, who have the opportunity to sit down with politicians.
Sure.
And who have and to share their heart. And I wonder, does that white evangelical pastor, when he goes in, does he say the same thing as that African-American pastor? And sometimes I don't think they do. So they need to be on the same page. They need to go together as brothers, saying this is what needs to happen. And when the body of Christ, when Christians start to see people as people, see them the way that Christ does, when there is injustice, everybody will stand up together. The problem is we still don't see that, because the reality is when you're the majority, you want your privileges, you want the perks. I mean, that's just the way it is. You want those perks. You don't want certain people moving into your neighborhood. Maybe you don't want certain people going to the same school as your kids, because if they did, your kid might not play on the sports team they want to play on. So you want some of those perks, and we have to be honest about that. And that just shows that we don't have the right focus. Our focus is to be on eternity. And I think we've gotten away from that in the church. We've gotten away from what matters. When you get to the end of your life, right, no one talks about how much money you have. You ever been to funerals? They don't talk about your money. They talk about what you did that mattered, your actions. And I think we need people of action as believers.
Yeah, I mean, I think as we're talking, I can't help but thinking about the sheep and the goats and the least of these, and the reality of that passage. And I don't know if we focus enough on that at all. I'm certain we don't. Anything else I'm missing, man? Eric, Will?
Man, I listened to the sermon of a bishop, an Anglican bishop, who preached at Nelson Mandela's funeral. And I never looked at this passage before, but it's so true in terms of our prophetic moment as a church. And he took the passage of Luke 19, you know, the parable of the talents, where a man had a field, and he gathered 3 of his servants, and he gave one 5 and the other 2 and the other 1. And then he went on a day's travel, and he came back and to see what they did with their talents. And one took their talent, the one that had 5 doubled their talent. And the master said, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant, enter into the joy of your master." Then he goes to the second one. And the second one with the 2 talents doubled his to 4. And he said, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of your master." And what happened with the third one that had the 1 talent? He buried it.
Yeah.
And this Black Anglican bishop said, oftentimes we applaud the first 2 slaves or servants, and we use the third one as a way of preaching about stewardship, and not how did he say it? He said, preaching in a way that sort of as a warning against how to live out your Christianity when God gives you your talent. He said, actually, if you think about this passage, that is not what that passage is about. And he talks about the passage literally happens before this passage, which is this Zacchaeus, who was a tax collector, and was extorting people. Rome was brutal to people. Not only would they take money from, the taxes owed from people, but they would also take extra off the top. And Zacchaeus gets saved. Mm-hmm. And after he gets saved, what happens? He gives back to the poor. 4 times the amount he exploited them from. And then right after that, it goes right into this parable about this master giving all these people talents. And then after that story is the story of Jesus entering into the temple.
Yeah. And
he says, to make it plain and simple, he said, actually consider the third person in a society that economy was actually based on an agrarian system, not a coinage system, was actually doing the noble thing. He buried the talent because anyone that owned coins back then got it through exploitation and usury. And so when he buried the talent, he was exposing the system of his day and actually living subversively. Yeah. And he said, that's what we see actually in the parable of, not the parable, but Zacchaeus, right? That leads up to the story, right? Zacchaeus takes his money and he uses it differently. He buries the talent because he refuses to participate in an unjust system. Can you imagine when Zacchaeus got saved? He goes back to Rome and said, I became a Christian. I can't exploit people anymore. And then right after the story, what happens? Jesus is actually in the temple and he turns, he goes in and turns the tables over because the religious system was exploiting people financially. And so he goes into this whole story about how Nelson Mandela was willing to bury his talent and to live subversively in the culture and speak not only to the political systems of his day, but to also speak to the religious systems of his day. And that's where I feel like the church prophetic moment is speaking powerfully and prophetically to the institutions of our day culturally, but also speaking prophetically to the religious systems of our day prophetically.
I think what I'm hearing really from both you guys is the challenge is to be compelled by the gospel to live sacrificially, subversively, in a way that is not pursuing safety, American dream, those things, but is on mission in a way that, I can't help but think of one of our elders, Bernie Elliott. Bernie's had 4 kids, and his last child was born with Down syndrome. Beautiful little boy. Bernie gets a passion for that community as he's thrust into it, of other parents that have Down syndrome children. And Bernie has now adopted 3 or 4 more children with severe Down syndrome or disabilities, even more so than his son, to love on those kids. He got 8 kids now, and him and his wife. And I thought to myself when he began to do this, wow, like he has sacrificed the rest of his life for this community. And in Bernie's, as you just see Bernie live the gospel, his goal was never to be healthy, safe, house, get the kids through college, have a 30-year plan and pension. You know what I mean? His goal has always been, he's always lived on the edge of the gospel in that regard and living in such a way. And God brought his little boy into his life that launched him into this whole new community. How many of us are willing to do that? Even in this issue, live in a way that sacrifices safety, sacrifices finances, sacrifices time, makes your life uncomfortable, does the hard thing. It's a challenge, and the gospel really does compel us to that.
Amen. Well, yeah, I would agree. I would agree. And I think we can only do it, right? It only happens when we evaluate ourselves. We look at the mirror. Every believer needs to evaluate themselves and ask themselves the question, am I doing what Christ has asked me to do?
Yeah.
We typically don't do it. We may look at other people and compare ourselves to other people, but we need to compare ourselves to the master. And if we're in the areas that we fall short, we need to address them. And until we do that, we're not going to make change. We're not going to move forward. I truly believe that when we see people the way that Christ sees us, that it will move us to action. But until that happens, we'll struggle, be in the same boat.
I'm going to ask a strange question, and it's really not their time, but in terms of, I think it was more appropriate to have the discussion we had, but I just find it interesting. In this moment, I have dozens and dozens of police officer friends. What's your thoughts in that regard? Folks that, honestly, the folks that I know are hurting bad, like they frustrated, infuriated by the video as well. But there's a culture. There's I don't know. I think it's worth saying. What do you guys think about that?
I mean, W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the fiercest lead intellectuals, first African-American to get a PhD from Harvard, wrote a book called Souls of Black Folks. And in it, he argued that Black folks oftentimes have to live with a double consciousness. Like, what does it mean to live in America, but be Black in America, right? Like, for us as African-Americans, we don't feel fully American and we don't feel fully African. Like, we find ourselves living somewhere in between, sort of the hyphen. Our life is in the hyphen, right? Because we have to navigate systems that are set up for white folks. And so what does it mean to work in white institutions and retain a sense of self as a Black person and not lose who you are culturally? I think as Christians, whether you're Black or a police officer, whether you work at a school system and you're trying to live missionally, we have to live upside down, right? Our citizenship is not of this earth.
Yeah.
And as much pain as a police officer has to live in, trying to live in between the two worlds, right? Being sympathetic to George Floyd and his family and the fact that Black man got executed, and yet at the same time work for a police force, that double consciousness is what we're all called to live into.
Sure.
You see what I'm saying? We're not just called to live into it. Everybody's called to live into it.
Of course.
I feel for my police officer, because I got police officer friends that have to live in that as well. And that's the nature of the kingdom.
Yeah.
Right now in the not yet, right? We're not Republicans. We're not Democrats. It's a whole different category of living that we're called to live into. And so I empathize with my brothers. I understand, like, on the one hand, you know, like,
a lot of them out there spending time mentoring, working, and then someone does this, and it's like, man, here we go. Like, here we go. It's going to be, you know.
Yes. And it's sort of like us. Like, I'm sure Will can tell you, you know, like, you're in these white church spaces or white parachurch spaces, and you believe in the best of that Christian organization, and yet they let you down.
Mm-hmm.
And yet you have to be something other. You've got to be something different. You know what I mean? You've got to hold them on the one hand and on the other. And that's what Christ calls us all to.
I think they do a unique job, Jeremy, our policemen. We need to be thankful for them and encourage them. And they need to, as believers, especially those who are believers, we know that God has placed them there.
Yeah.
Why has he placed them there? He has placed them. They need to enforce the law. They also have the responsibility. And I think this is where it gets tough when we talk about systems. When they know someone is not performing their job in the right way, and they know their biases or views, and they know how it can affect others, they need to speak up.
Yep.
Now, I'm sure there's a chain of command, but they have to speak up. I would contend, especially the last video, what the gentleman did who killed George Floyd, those other guys, they knew what he was like.
No question.
He didn't like it like the first time. They know what he's like.
Question.
But
one of those guys I think was brand spanking new too. Right. So here you got the senior guy. You got the senior guy who's probably, you know.
You have to remember what we said earlier. Don't ever forget, Jesus was radical. Yeah. So when you're in those jobs as a police officer, you got to be willing to step up, and you got to trust the Lord for the outcome. People are like, oh, I can't say anything. I can't do this. No, you can. Because if you believe that he's placed you there, then he'll take care of the rest of the details. And I think, so, like, once again, we put I've done it. Instead of putting Christ first, we put everything else first. If I do this, what will be the consequence to my job or my position? And in their role, because they have so much power and authority, our believing policemen have to speak up. And I think more often than not, they may not do that in the way that they should.
Yeah. Well, there's got to be some cultural shift, that's for sure, and some guts, you know. You guys, man, I appreciate you so much. We've taken. There's so many things I could talk to you guys all night. I'm grateful that you guys are willing to do this.
Appreciate you.
And I think it's just the beginning of the conversation, really. But man, I feel challenged, and I actually feel like after our conversation tonight, I have some direction. You know, I think I have some direction, and it's a good thing. It's a good thing. Thank you, guys.
Appreciate you, man.
Thank you, man. Appreciate you.
Yeah, let me hit stop on the record here quick, and then